this evening. It's good to see you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Looks like we got a pretty small crowd tonight, only 13 people here, but it's my favorite 13. Good to see you. I hope the rest of you watch this on recording before you take the exam. Cool. Oh, okay. Tara's actually coming home from the beach right now. Interesting. Sounds like fun. Hi, Etta. Good to see you. Sounds like fun. Hi, Etta. Good to see you. Oh my goodness. There we go again. Nice. So, does anybody have any questions before we get started? I know, Nicole. Every freaking time. You think I'd figure it out after a while, but nope. Wow, what are you doing in Ohio, Brady? North Carolina beach, Riley. Charlotte is the North Carolina beach somewhere. Okay. Hello, Hannah Campbell. Good to see you. All right. So we've got a pretty good group of people. So let's go ahead and go over the exam for the evening. Can everybody hear me well enough? How's the sound? How's the video? Nothing's too choppy. Everything, the signal's coming through pretty good. Fantastic. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, midterm exam 2 covers chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. We will have 50 multiple choice, true, false, and matching items, and you will have 50 minutes to take the exam. I think it's 50 minutes. 50 questions, 55 questions. Oh man, I've forgotten what I said, what the exam is going to be. I think it's 55 questions in 50 minutes, something like that. Okay? So let's see. What's a great question by... So, Joy Ratzman, what are the answers to the exam? Okay, 12 A's. There are 13 answers are B. There are 6 answers that are C. And there are 9 answers that are D. Does that help you out some, Joy? Oh, come on, I told you what letters. Less than a minute. Yes, about a minute a question. Listen, you should be able to answer these questions in a minute. If you're not supposed to be using course notes, you're not supposed to be using PowerPoints, you're not supposed to be using any resources to take this exam. So this exam time is typically consistent with the regular seated exam that you take. Okay? Yes, the time is short. Okay? Do not use your notes. I know I can't necessarily catch you, but I promise you, if I do catch anybody cheating or violating the academic integrity standards, I will use every bit of energy that I use to teach to hunt you down. Okay? So please. Yeah, I know. Well, that's tough. I have no idea what a T exam is, but this ain't one. So you'll have to figure it out, Joy. Okay? Do your best. You're breaking my heart. This is from chapter 5. Yes, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. Okay, so from chapter 5, I do want you to know what transduction means, and I do want you to know the difference between sensation and perception. All right, so transduction is the turning of physical energy into patterns of action potentials. Chapter 5, Chapter 6, Chapter 7, and Chapter 8. Chapter 9 is motivation. Riley, and that will be on the next exam. So it is only 4 chapters on this exam. Chapter 5, Chapter 6, Chapter 7, and Chapter 8. Okay. So, I think I have at least one, maybe two of those hotspot questions where I ask you to pick out the correct sensory cortex of the brain. Notice where the olfactory cortex is. Notice where the gustatory cortex is. Notice where the primary visual cortex is. So I may have a couple of hotspot questions. I will expect you to know that the gustatory is for taste, the olfactory is for the sense of smell, the somatosensory is for touch. And I do want you to know what an association cortex is. Those are the parts of the brain that put the senses together so they can work together. Hell to you, Gita. It's good to see you too. Okay. So I can promise you that there will be, I already see 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 questions on these first 2 slides. I do want you to know that the optic chiasm is where the information from the left half of your visual field goes to the right half of your brain, and where the information from the right half of your visual field goes to the left half of your brain. You should know that you should know the function of the superior colliculus. And I do have a question or two about rods and cones. Remember, rods are for black and white vision. They work better in low light. Cones are for color vision. You have 3 different kinds of cones. Not 4, not 2, but 3 different kinds of cones. And they each respond to different wavelengths of light to give you the experience of color vision. Any questions so far? Remember, all of the senses except for smell are processed through the thalamus. I don't see any questions so far, so I'm assuming everything's going well. You folks have went quiet on me. I guess that's because you're deliberately taking notes. Feverishly taking notes, correct? Oh my goodness. Yes. And remember, we talked about the difference between sensation and perception. Sensation is recording the pattern of sensory experiences in your brain, and perception is making sense of that pattern of sensory activation. Remember? So not only do you have to have the sense, but you have to be able to figure out what it is you are looking at. And I suggested to you that there are several principles by which we organize visual input. You see the pictures right down here below. I think there is at least 1, maybe 2 questions on Gestalt vision principles. Okay, what I'll do is I'll give you the picture and I'll ask you to tell me which Gestalt vision principle we are demonstrating. Okay, so that's all for Chapter 5. There may be an odd question about a hair cell or an olfactory cortex, but I don't recall any of those. Most of the questions are going to be, like I said, about the sensory cortexes of the brain, transduction, association cortexes, the pathways along the visual center, and the different functions of rods and cones and Gestalt principles of visual organization. Those represent the 13 questions from Chapter 5. Does anybody have any questions so far? All right. Let's talk a little bit about Chapter 6. Yep, the answers are C, C, A, B, 3 D's, and 1 more D, and a false. Okay, fantastic. All right, so this chapter 6 is the chapter about learning. Remember, we talked about the behaviorist perspective, John Watson, B.F. Skinner. We talked about classical conditioning. We talked about operant conditioning. I talked about systematic desensitization, and I talked about shaping. All of those concepts will be represented on the test. So, there will be an example of classical conditioning where you have to identify the unconditioned, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, and the unconditioned response. Okay? So I will have that. There are no short answers on this exam, Riley. It was my goal not to put any short answers on this exam. So with behaviorism, you will have to know, and I do want you to know behaviors. How do behaviorists feel about the mind? Do you remember? What do the behaviorists feel about the mind as a target of scientific study? Okay, I'm assuming somebody's gonna, it ain't important. There you go, Tara Solomon. Rock on. Right. Absolutely. Now, how did behaviorists feel about genetics and having inborn traits? What did they feel about that? Tara Solomon? I'm going to see if somebody answers that as well. So you're going to have to know basically the general principles of the behaviorist perspective. It's more about the environment and about behavior rather than mind or genes. Absolutely. Okay, so I am going to give you an example of a classical conditioning paradigm, and I'm going to expect you to identify the UCS, UCR, CS, and CR. I do want you to know what acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery relate to. There are 2 questions on the exam off of this chart right here. Okay, I do want you to know the case of little Albert and what the point of the little Albert study was, right? So little Albert was the first, was a demonstration that you could use classical conditioning to condition a phobia, right? Remember we talked about systematic desensitization. If you can train a phobia into little Albert, you can train a phobia out of little Albert. So systematic desensitization uses classical conditioning to condition somebody not to have a phobia. Remember we talked about the fear hierarchy that you see right here on underneath me. And then I want you to know that you pair that with a relaxation technique. Remember? So with systematic desensitization, you pair the feared stimulus with a new emotion, that of relaxation. And you try to move up the fear hierarchy while maintaining a sense of calm. Does that make sense? Everybody got that? If you remember, we did talk about shaping as a way to create complex behaviors in animals. Remember, in operant conditioning, the animal has to randomly engage in the behavior. You reinforce that behavior, and then the behavior becomes more likely. But sometimes we want to train an animal to engage in a really complex behavior. And remember, we have to start by shaping some behavior that is similar to, but not exactly like the desired behavior. So we talked about shaping. I do want you to know what a set of successive approximations are. Absolutely. Mine's Dr. Pepper, Riley C. It's Dr. Pepper as far as you know. As far as you know. Okay. Now, here's the deal. So for behaviorism, I want you to know how to do a classical conditioning breakdown. I want you to know the difference between acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. I want you to know about the case of little Albert and how we use systematic desensitization to classically condition people out of phobias. I then want you to know about shaping and operant conditioning in general. And there's an example on your exam where you're asked to differentiate between positive and negative reinforcers, positive and negative punishers. Any questions? Sweet tea. Oh, you're so funny. You're so funny. So those are the questions that I have about behaviorism. 13 questions from chapter 6 as well. Oh, one quick question. What was that one study? What did they demonstrate with animals, especially monkeys, that was problematic for the behaviorist perspective? Do you remember those studies by Wolfgang Kohler on Tenerife, the Canary Islands? Yes, I can go over UCS, UCR. Yes, I can go over those again. Do you remember what was that demonstration? What did Wolfgang Kohler demonstrate animals had that was so difficult for behaviorism theoretically? Does anybody remember? That word that started with an I? I wonder who's got it. Anybody got it? Insight learning. Absolutely, Tara. Very good. I'm super impressed. Yeah, Riley, I can go over UCS, CS, CR, UCR, and CR. So, let's say, the UCS and the UCR represent the reflex response, whatever happens automatically. So if you remember, when Pavlov put the meat powder on the dog's tongue, the dog salivated. That's a reflex response. Does a dog have to learn how to salivate to the smell of meat? No, absolutely. So it's unconditioned. So that's an unconditioned stimulus. And then the response to this natural stimulus is called the unconditioned response. So, for example, when I smell pizza, I salivate. The smell of pizza is the unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation in response to the pizza is the unconditioned response. Does that make sense? Now, in classical conditioning, what they do is they pair a neutral stimulus with a reflex response. So every Friday night, this guy named Patrick delivers the pepperoni pizza to my front door. It was pizza night at my house. I don't know about y'all, but we always do pizza because I don't feel like cooking on Friday night, right? And so this guy, Tim, shows up at the door. I hear knock, knock, knock. I say, "Hi, Tim." I smell the pizza, and then I salivate because of the pizza. Okay? Right. Condition is learned and unconditioned is automatic. And every week I hear knock, knock, knock. I see Tim, and then I smell this pizza, which makes me salivate. I see Tim, I smell this pizza, and it makes me salivate. So, this past Tuesday, I was at the grocery store, and I turned around, and lo and behold, Tim is standing right behind me. And when I saw Tim, I started salivating. And you might say, what in the world happened? Well, the salivating to Tim was a conditioned response, and Tim is now a conditioned stimulus. Because I've associated pizza with Tim, every time I see Tim, I start to salivate. So does that make sense? So, smelling the pizza smell is the unconditioned stimulus. Salivating to the pizza smell is the unconditioned response. Tim is the conditioned stimulus, and then salivating when I see Tim at the grocery store is the conditioned response. Okay? And so I have an example of that in the exam that you have to identify the 4 parts. Remember, whatever looks like the reflex response, whatever looks like it would happen automatically, is going to get the U, either the UCS or the UCR. The UCS causes the UCR. Right, okay, great. Fantastic. And so that's sort of how I do the psychology class, Riley. You see me, I make you laugh, and laughing makes you feel good. So I talk psychology, which you don't necessarily like, but then I make you laugh, and you feel good. I make you laugh, and you feel good, and you hear psychology. And so after a while, I begin to pair psychology with you laughing. And then after a while, when you hear about psychology, psychology is the conditioned stimulus, and your conditioned response is that you like psychology. Exactly, and you like the class. That's exactly how it works, Etta. That's exactly how it works. Yes, you do, Etta. Yes, you do. Okay, so that's chapter 6. Well, that's good to hear, Riley. That's my job. Okay, so that's half of your exam. 13 questions on the senses and 13 questions on learning. Oh, by the way, for learning, I do want you to know the difference between a positive and a negative reinforcer. Okay? Do you remember the difference between a positive and a negative reinforcer? So, remember, a reinforcer is any outcome which makes you do the behavior more often. Exactly. So if I give you extra credit for coming to webinar, that's adding something to get you to do that behavior more. That's a positive reinforcer. But you know what I could do? I could drop a 0 every time you come to a webinar. And so I could take something negative away every time you do a behavior I want you to do again. That would be a negative reinforcer. So if you come to webinar, I give you extra credit. That's a positive reinforcer. If you come to webinar and I drop a 0 from your grade, that's taking away something negative. That would be a negative reinforcer. Right. But just remember that negative and positive reinforcers make the behavior more likely to occur. It's only the punishers that are designed to make a behavior less likely. And I have at least two questions on reinforcers and punisher types. Exactly. Very good, Riley C. Reinforcer makes the behavior more likely. Punisher makes the behavior less likely. Okay, chapter 7. Chapter 7. Uh-oh. Okay, yeah. So chapter 7. I have several questions about Atkinson and Shiffren model of information processing. Okay, so remember I showed you that picture of the 3-box model of memory, and I have a couple of questions about sensory memory, a couple of questions about short-term memory, and a couple of questions about your long-term memory. Remember, the quality of the memory trace in long-term memory depends upon how you elaborate on how you rehearse that information in your short-term memory. So remember, sensory memory is preconscious. Short-term memory is where stuff is going while you're thinking about it. And your long-term memory is where you store stuff until you're going to need it again. The smallest of these 3 memory stores is your sensory memory, and the largest of these memory stores is your long-term memory. Remember, you can keep 5 to 9 chunks in your short-term memory, And if you want to improve the size of your short-term memory, you have to learn how to chunk the things that you are given. So I have a couple of questions about building a list. Remember, if I was to give you a grocery list of 20 items, how would you remember those 20 items, Lydia? Do you remember? If I gave you a list of 15 words to pick up, you would use the chunking. Absolutely. I'm going to expect you to know that chunking. Okay. I'm going to expect you to know that the sensory memory is pre-conscious, right? Grouping them into meals. Absolutely, Etta. Absolutely. Now, how big is your long-term memory? You know? Endless. There you go. It's endless. Absolutely. Remember, I talked to you about getting stuff into your long term memory. It has to go through your hippocampus, it has to be consolidated. And remember, the way you think about something when in your short term memory determines the strength of the memory trace that you create in your long term memory. And I talked about maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal. So if you want to remember a phone number, you can repeat it over and over and over, and that's maintenance rehearsal. But if you really, really want to remember something, relate it, elaborate it to something that's already in your mind. And in the lecture I gave on cognitive psychology a couple of weeks ago, I talked about my friend Linwood's phone number that is 776 1066. And I suggested to you that instead of trying just to remember those numbers, I elaborated or related those numbers to historical dates that I already had in my mind. Exactly, Tara. I used elaborative rehearsal. Okay. Oh, and by the way, remember, if I stress out your short term memory, in giving you a list of words, what does the serial position effect say about what you're going to remember? If I give you a list of 15 words and you can only remember 7 to 9 of them, which 7 to 9 are you going to remember? Exactly, the first and the last. You're going to forget the stuff in the middle. Absolutely. Nice. I do want you to know that. There's a question or two about that on the test. Okay, I want you to know the difference between explicit and implicit memories. Remember, an explicit memory is a conscious memory, something you have to think about. If I asked you who the first president of the United States was, and you told me George Washington, that would be an explicit memory that you have to bring up into your consciousness. If I asked you if you had a cake at your third birthday party and you had to remember back to your third birthday party and you said, yes, I had a cake, that would be an explicit memory. Now remember, procedural memories or classical conditioning, you don't necessarily have to think about, but they are memories that affect you. So you don't have to think about riding a bike or dialing a phone or driving a car, but they are memories nonetheless. You just don't have to think about them consciously. So we're going to call those implicit memories. And I remember there are a couple of questions on the test asking you to differentiate between explicit and implicit memories. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, Etta. That's a good way to think about it. I do have a couple of questions on where in the brain you have different memories. Remember, the hippocampus is the part of your brain that processes memories. They're not stored there, but the hippocampus is important for consolidating them. Remember, your temporal lobes are where memories are stored. Remember, cerebellum is where procedural memories are stored. And remember, where do we store memories for faces? Ooh, that's a good one, Riley. That's a good way to think of it. E is for effort and E is for explicit. What part of our temporal lobe do we use to remember faces? Fusiform gyrus. I'm going to make you say that so many times, Tara, that you can't forget it. You're going to leave my class and say, I don't remember anything that guy taught me except the fusiform gyrus. I like it too, man. It's very melodic. There you go. I'm glad I got it nailed in your brain. That's the only thing you learn. People are going to, what the hell are they teaching over at Wake Tech? Okay, so actually that's all the questions. Oh, I do have a question about memory, about episodic memories. Remember, memories are not recordings. Episodic memories are not recordings. They're very malleable. Every time you retrieve an episodic memory, that memory changes. And if you'll remember in your textbook, and I think I talked about it in lecture, there's that very famous lady, Elizabeth Loftus, who found that people's memory for a car accident depended upon the words she used to ask the question. Do you remember that? She said, how fast were the cars going when they ran into one another? Or how fast were the cars going when they smashed into one another? Right? There you go. And if it was smashed, they said the cars were moving faster and they were more likely to remember glass. Very good. Exactly. Exactly, Riley. Thank you. Okay, so I do want you to know that memories are malleable. So that's 13 questions. Oh, remember our memory is organized in terms of schemas. Schemas is a set of interrelated cognitions about a concept. So when I ask you to think of the word lion, you can say it's furry, it has a mane, it has a tail, and it chases and eats gazelles. That's a schema for a lion. And remember, our brain is organized into associated networks of schemas. So there's a question about schemas and a question about associated networks. Okay? There are probably 3 or 4 questions about the Atkinson and Shiffren model. There are 2 or 3 questions about the types of memory stores. There are 2 or 3 questions about areas of the brain related to memory. Okay. That's 13 questions. So you have 13 questions on chapter 5, 13 questions on chapter 6, 13 questions on chapter 7 for 39 questions. And so that means you have 11 questions on IQ testing. I do want you to know that IQ tests were invented in France in 1906. I do want you to know that the difference between a test of aptitude and a test of achievement. IQ tests are tests of aptitude. They're designed to measure how quickly you could learn something new. And that's different from a test of achievement, which just tests your mastery of a set of knowledge that you're supposed to know, a body of knowledge. So the exam in this class is a test of achievement. It's going to tell me if you learned chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. It is not going to tell me how clever you are and how smart you could be. It's just a test that tests whether or not you've learned a set of material. An IQ test, in a sense, tries to tell us how clever you are, how quickly you could learn something. Okay? So, there is a question. You do need to know this formula right here below me. The old IQ test used the ratio method. They tried to figure out your mental age and compare that to your chronological age and multiply it times 100. So, for example, if I am 6 years old, but I know, let's say I am 6 years old, but I know what a 9-year-old knows, my ratio is 1.5. 1.5 times 100 is 150. My IQ would be 150. Ah, that's it. You were ahead. I was wondering why you were asking about chapter 9, Riley. NCLB program is in use in the grade. Wow, Spencer, you use some acronyms that I am not familiar with. NCLB, EOC, and EOG. I'm assuming you're talking about standardized testing. And yes, those standardized tests are tests of achievement rather than tests of aptitude. So somebody says, hey, this is what eighth graders need to know. And then they test you to see if all eighth graders know that information. Yep, that's exactly what it is. Those are tests of achievement. Okay, Riley. All right, so William Stern. I do want you to know the first widespread use of IQ tests was in World War One. Let's see. And then, I've got one question. I can see two questions. I can see three or four. And then I do have several questions on multiple intelligences, triarchic theory, and emotional intelligence. Okay, so remember IQ tests were developed to measure people's school readiness. But it turns out that being smart is a lot more than just doing well in school. There are different things that should be included in the discussion of what it means to be intelligence. And so your book talks about larger theories of intelligence that try to think about intelligence more broadly than IQ tests. All right. I do want you to know, let's see, that the triarchic theory by Robert Sternberg, one of the neat things that it adds to IQ test is what we would call common sense and creativity. All right. So Robert Sternberg says, yes, analytical intelligence or the knowledge of how to do well in school is one form of intelligence, but then he adds creativity and he adds common sense to the definition of what intelligence is. I think that's a great expansion of the theory of intelligence. Now, Howard Gardner, on the other hand, expands intelligence even more. And what he does is he says we ought to include physical movement as a form of intelligence too. All right? And also, aside from physical movement, he says we should argue emotional control as a form of intelligence. And he has interpersonal and intrapersonal. All right? And so, whereas Sternberg says it's just you want to add creativity and common sense, Gardner says, yes, what about physical ability and emotional control? They're part of what it means to be intelligence. And then if you look down here at the emotional intelligence theory, they say, you know what, really, you can get rid of everything else. The only thing that is important is your emotional control. And that's really what determines how successful people would be. Yes, practical knowledge, Spencer King. Think of practical knowledge as sort of common sense, your ability to figure out the ropes in your given situation. I don't know, Spencer, where you work, but I'm sure there's somebody at where you work that still hasn't figured out how to do their job correctly. And you're like, geez, that guy Andy is such an idiot. He doesn't know blah, 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 blah. He has been here so long and he still hasn't figured out how to do these common sense things. You're talking about Andy's practical knowledge, right? And practical knowledge is sort of domain specific. If your nurse comes in and you say, hey, nurse, have you ever seen a 2x4? And your nurse doesn't know that carpentry term, you wouldn't feel bad about your nurse, right? On the other hand, if your nurse comes in and you says, how's my red blood count? And the nurse goes, what's a red blood cell? You would say, wow, this nurse does not know the common sense stuff that they are supposed to know being in this particular area. So think of common sense or practical knowledge as your ability to function in your little practical world. Andy the knucklehead, right? Okay, well, that's it. So, that's all I have to share with you tonight. Do you have any questions about the exam that you would like to ask me before I close this out? We've been going about 40 minutes now, and I feel like I've given you all the questions on the exam. I'm going to sit here and wait a second. Nope, 39, 50 questions. 13 for chapter 5, 13 for chapter 6, 13 for chapter 7, and 11 for chapter 8. Yes, don't forget to look over your past homeworks. There are probably 2 or 3 questions that I took directly from the homework. Most of them are different, but on every chapter, I tried to take 1 or 2 questions from your homework just to encourage you to go back and study your old homeworks. Yeah, I did a bunch of questions last time and had more time. I'm trying a different strategy this time, Tara. It's only going to be 50 questions in a shorter amount of time. I'm sure you'll all do well. If anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text and I will help you out. You should be able to look back at your own homeworks by going to the grade book and clicking on the homework grade in the grade book, and that should pop up the homework. And click on the link. There you go. Joy Ratzman's telling you how to do it. Thank you, Joy. Cool, no problem, folks. It's great seeing you again. Have a great weekend. I will have discussion boards and extra credit grades updated tomorrow, probably by 6 p.m. I'll be available all weekend if you need me via Remind, and the exam is due Monday night at 11:59 p.m. All right? Hey, thanks for coming. Y'all have a great week. I'm going to stay online and answer any text questions for a couple of minutes after this broadcast ends. But other than that, I'd like to say take care, and I will see you next week.